Welcome to Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robertson and Gaye Francis discuss the concept of breaking SFAIRP into three parts: so far, as is, and reasonably practicable. We hope you enjoy the chat. If you do, please give us a rating and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. And if you'd like more information on R2A's work or have any feedback or topic ideas, head to the website r2a.com.au.
Good morning, Richard. Welcome to a podcast session this morning.
Good morning, Gaye. It's really strange to be recording a podcast online in remote locations. We don't do this very often.
I was just going to say, yes, today's podcast looks a little bit different. So, yes, we will see how it goes from here. So today we're going to talk about breaking SFAIRP down, and this really comes from probably the key insight that we got from our forum that we had recently from Joseph Coleiro, the lawyer who we invited to the session. And I think for me, that was one of the key takeaways from that session. And he broke SFAIRP down into three bits. So SF, so far, and then as is, AI, and then reasonably practical, RP. And we're just going to go through each of those elements today and see if we can explain that in a little bit more detail.
Yep. So you'd like me to explain that?
Do you want to start, and I'll add as I go along?
Well, in Joe's presentation, he made the point that so far, does that mean as low or any other term that you might choose to use? And the real question is, an example we normally sort of give, if you're flying at 30,000 feet and something goes wrong and you're possibly going to fall out of the sky, it doesn't really help too much. The pilot comes and says, yes, we actually achieved our target level of risk or safety, for example. We do realise there was more we could have done on the way down, but we didn't do it because we didn't think it was necessary because we couldn't afford it, for example, or some other sort of decision. The idea is you're supposed to actually do so far as much as you can.
Yeah, he sort of used the words that you drill down as far as you can go.
Yeah, that's right. As is, well, that is at the time that you make the decision. And the part of the reason why we're particularly interested in that, I've got to give a course in the Latrobe Valley to one of the power stations down there. So I thought I'd go and look up that. I don't know if everyone remembers, there was a fire in the open cut pit down there. And they were prosecuted under the OHS Act in Victoria on the so far as reasonably practicable. And when I was just looking it up, the prosecution from the Victorian Work Cover Authority alleges, under the relevant section of that Act, that so far as was reasonably practicable, meaning at the time the decision was made. So before the event, it is so far as is reasonably practicable, and after the event, it was so far as was reasonably practicable, meaning the is part is actually quite important. And you and I both commented that a lot of people leave the I out when they actually just sort of put the proposition up, where in fact, once the lawyers start using these terms, it's actually quite important.
I think that was one of the key things also that came out of the event. There was some discussion that courts use hindsight to decide, what was reasonably practical in the stages, but that is, as is, really says that hindsight is not considered. It is what the information that you have at the time and the decision you made at the time, what was reasonably practical then.
Yeah, that's right. And that's popped up a number of times, because what's always puzzling to us, you see, from the point of view of being an expert witness, after the event, the experts, the thing's gone wrong. So you're trying to dream up what could have been done if it had been done was reasonable. And then the court looks at what the experts said and then tries to determine whether those things that were thought up by the experts with the advantage of hindsight were reasonable without that hindsight that they ought to have been thought about prior to the event. I still find it very difficult to believe that, that post-event doesn't have some influence on the decision-making of the court, but I'm not obviously in a position to comment on that particularly.
That's true. And then reasonably practical is sort of what's written in the legislation under Section 18. And so that has 5 elements: the likelihood of the hazard or the risk concerned occurring, the degree of harm that might result from that hazard or risk, what the person concerned knows or ought reasonably to know about the hazard or the risk, the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate or minimise the risk, and after assessing the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, the costs associated with available ways of doing that. But again, cost comes down to that grossly disproportionate tests that it goes by. It's not just, oh, it's expensive, so we're not going to do it. You've actually got to consider it grossly disproportionate.
Well, it was interesting because, as I said, I was just looking at this case because they actually were prosecuted for 14 charges originally, and they got, I think, successfully. The case was won on 5 charges. Perhaps I might just read them out because it's kind of interesting to sort of see what they were actually talking about. I suppose the other point just to note is that when they were taken or were prosecuted, it was done on not for 2 parts. Under Section 21, that an employer must, so far as reasonably practical, provide and maintain employees of the employer with a working environment that is safe and without risks to health. But then Section 23 of the Victorian Act also says an employer must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the persons other than employees of the employer not exposed. So it was not only the people who worked there, it was the community as a whole. And I think it's one of the reasons why the prosecution was taken. And that because they were prosecuted under 2 pieces of legislation, both the OHS Act and the environmental legislation. And it was tried by a jury, and they were successfully
Convicted.
for 5 points. I'll just go through them. Failing to perform an adequate risk assessment as to the possibility of fire from an external source. Failing to have adequate reticulated water supply. Failing to slash vegetation on the face of the northern batters. Failing to bring wetting down on the northern batters on the really hot day. And failing to maintain staffing on the mine of sufficient numbers and expertise to suppress fires in a hurry. All true, I suppose. The other thing
I think one of the interesting things about that is, and we say this in our courses, negligence arises because of unimplemented, insufficient, or failed precautions or controls. And 3 of those were failed controls.
Yeah, that's right.
So they were things that they should have been doing that, they weren't doing well enough to protect them on the day of the fire. And I think that's really interesting that that's what they've gone down for.
Well, the other thing was that the judge lists a whole lot of previous decisions made in different cases and sort of quotes relevant things. And I just going through them out of curiosity, and just the way one of the other judges, when they were expressing the way in which he meant to go about this stuff. Hence, in determining the gravity or seriousness of the offence, as in such a case, the gravity or seriousness of a breach is to be measured by reference to the potential consequences of the breach, which is rather interesting, isn't it? Because remember how we always do it. So what's the credible worst case? And then we work backwards from there.
It's consequence basis. It doesn't actually consider the likelihood.
Yep. In the first instance, at least that's our perception of it. And that's the way we've always done it. And that's what we had interpreted from our experience as expert witnesses, that it's really that, the extent of the consequences, that's what you need to assess in the first instance. And then you do the likelihood versus the balance the significance of the risk versus the effort required to reduce it. Sort of comes second.
When you're weighing up what the controls that you could put in place. So that's helping you with your reasonableness part, isn't it?
Correct. And that's just what I was just reading. I thought, well, that's interesting because that's, I mean, we find it, for the most part, we get given cases for to review. And, I just sort of, as I said, I was giving this course in the Trove Valley in a couple of weeks, and I thought I better go and have a look to see what actually happened there, because I suspect everyone down there probably knows all about it, and having an opinion or review or have some insight into it might be really rather useful.
But I also think that it played on that, and it's sort of crystallized and supported what Joe was saying during the forum, that SFAIRP is broken into those 3 elements that we talked about.
Yep.
So far as you can absolutely go.
Yep.
And it's not the same as all of those other definitions that we talked about.
Yes.
As is at the time.
Yep.
And then reasonably practical is as defined in the Work Health and Safety legislation, or OHS legislation in Victoria. So if you break it into those 3, as we sort of said earlier in this podcast, leaving the is out or the I out has
implications.
It has implications, because it's sort of saying, well, it's not at the time that the decision was made. Now, our understanding is that most people think that that's inferred, or the intent remains in there of is, but it's often left out of some of the.
Well, the defence leave the eye out when they talk about SFAIRP. And one of the things that mystified me a bit was that the environmental legislation of Victoria has been modified to adopt what we had, and I think we've said it before, the SFAIRP principle. But in that particular act, it leaves the I out. It just says so far, but so far as practical, as far as reasonably practicable, not as is reasonably practicable. And
Yeah.
you know, this is part of our experience with lawyers. One word makes a difference.
Yes. So if you don't think it's significant, then you just have to be careful of this, and you don't want to be the test case to see whether it leaving the is out of your terminology is
I think it's
has implications.
Well, I think the other point too is that the important thing is to if the act says so FARP AI, then use AI. If it doesn't say it, then possibly leave it out. Because I don't know, I think it's going to be a matter for another podcast. But one of the things that also popped up in our session was that one of the things that seems to happen is sometimes people delay decisions about something until it's so late. So what's so far early in the process can't get up. And that's a difficult one, and I haven't thought that one through. How you meant to address that one? I think it's definitely another podcast.
No, absolutely right, and that's tricky. But I think that was the other key that came out of the forum, wasn't it? The legislation, and this is what we say to our clients: if the legislation uses so far as reasonably practical, as is reasonably practical so far, then make sure that that's what your policies and procedures and company how-to manuals actually address and
Correct.
use.
And that's why you've got to be wary of the risk management standard for just that reason.
Yeah. So all of these things that says some of these terminologies are interchangeable, we would just say, be careful when you do that, because our understanding is that they are not interchangeable.
And that was the advice that Joseph Coleiro explained to us. He said if the legislation says it a certain way, then that's the way and to which you will be tested, which, so far as I can tell, is precisely what happened with that bushfire risk matter.
So I think that's all we really want to say on that, but that was one of the key takeaways. Break your SFAIRP into the three categories.
Three parts.
Yep. Yeah. So far, drill down as far as you can go, as is, what you know at the time, and reasonably practical as defined in the legislation under Section 18.
And that's why I think our recommendation that you run SFAIRP workshops is so important, because and who's in the room when you make that decision, because that's testing what you knew at the time. Those three elements.
Yeah, especially the as is.
Especially the as is part, which is not something I think we previously sort of.
No.
I think we understood it, but I don't know we'd ever focused on it in any particular way.
I don't think we'd articulated it in the same way. So that was a very helpful articulation. So we hope our audience has also found that articulation useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Gaye.